Good morning. This is Dr. Obertashaka, and this is the Dr. Obertashaka Show. Before getting into today's topic, I want to again encourage people to subscribe to this show, the Dr. Obertashaka Show, and we'll be putting up directions underneath this show and other shows for those that don't know how to do the steps to subscribe. This is very important. It makes us stronger. To the loyal viewers of this show and to the new ones, particularly the loyal ones, I want to have a thank you for the suggestions that you've offered for ways to expand the show and improve it. I also want to thank viewers who have used their Facebook page to advertise this show. Keep on doing it. More people that do that, more people will get notice of the show. My goal always in starting this show was to reach especially younger people, but to reach our people. And so it's not surprising that our largest viewing audience is in the United States, but I always wanted this show to stretch out and to reach our people and people in general throughout the world. And that's because we're living in a global reality, and we need to have an exchange globally. And so I'm really happy to see that our viewership has grown to include Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, and we have viewers consistently from Jamaica, the United Kingdom, France, and also India. And then we have people from other parts of the world who have either signed on as Facebook friends or subscribed. So the fact that we're reaching a global audience is very heartwarming. I'm glad to see that. And I'd like to have your input because this show is for all of you. And while the main audience is African and African American, we're open to all people. And, you know, we're glad to see the viewership increasing with that group. Now, the last two shows have featured interviews with Dr. Theophil Obenga and Dr. Leonard Jeffries. And these were two very rewarding shows. How you doing, Roja? Good to see you. These were very rewarding discussions, the exchange with the master historian, philosopher, linguist, paleontologist, Dr. Theophil Obenga. That was very rewarding. And the discussion with Dr. Leonard Jeffries got a lot of jewels about history and culture, politics, and other things. And it became clear that with those two interviews, that the next show and probably the next couple of shows should be dealing with the topic of Pan Africanism. Most of you know I'm a Pan Africanist. I'm a revolutionary Pan African nationalist. Each of those have meaning. You've heard about the revolutionary. The meaning of Pan Africanism, for those of you that don't know, we'll explain it more in this show. And nationalism will also discuss that. But in the sixfold stages to mental freedom, while assimilation is ground bottom, not all Blacks in the US and throughout the world go through this stage, but a lot of us do. I did, Dr. Obenga did. Many Blacks in this country go through what's called Black identity, which a lot of us put down. That's the culture of our people. And that's why when the African from the United States is talking to an African from another part of the world, they may ask them, are you Black? By that, they mean, are you from here? Because it's not just the color of the skin they're talking about their identity, and it's shaped based on their culture. We're going to talk about that today. But the highest levels in the sixfold stages to mental freedom have to do with African identity and then revolutionary African consciousness. So the African identity is very important. African American culture is grounded in African culture with new elements. And of course, we know intrusions that we don't like, that we have to get rid of, that we in the 60s called Negroisms, you know. A lot of them trace back to the plantation, and then some of them are coming in as a result of the forces that have hit our community since 68 that I call a choice between two cultures. And some of these have been really lethal and deadly, and we can find them operating on our people globally. So this show and the next one will be focusing on Pan Africanism. And Pan Africanism is an outgrowth, as you'll see, of African people from the United States and the Caribbean. You'll see that. We'll get into that. But the key point to get is when this idea was formulated through a route that I'll discuss in a minute, the people who formulated it were very African. That is, the enslaved Africans that a lot of us haven't really studied. And so the transformations in their consciousness will lead to a number of developments, one of which is Pan-Africanism. So the topic for today is Pan-Africanism, the gift of Blacks in the United States and the Western Hemisphere, specifically the Caribbean, to Africa. Those who say and still argue we don't have a culture, well, we'll be discussing one of the most advanced and new aspects of this culture, Pan-Africanism, and the thing that gives it birth that I'll spend most of my time on this morning. When we interviewed Dr. Theophile Obenga, some of you were probably surprised to see, and many of you who are really conscious were pleased to see the level of support and collaboration going on between continents. In this case, between Dr. Theophile Obenga, one of my great masters, Dr. Jacob Carruthers, Professor James Smalls, Dr. Wade Nobles, Dr. Rosalind Jeffries, Dr. Leonard Jeffries' wife, who is a specialist in African art history, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, Professor John Henry Clark, Dr. Joseph Ben Yochanan, and many, many others, too many to name. Professor Bulanlela Wabogo that he referred to, who was teaching out at San Francisco State and helped me develop the sixfold stages to mental freedom. So those collaborations, you could call them intellectual or cultural, they're an expression of Pan-Africanism. In this case, collaborating while Dr. Obenga was here, it's between continents. So that could be viewed as just an intellectual conversation. But that it could happen is an expression of Pan-African consciousness and the fact that we see ourselves as being together. I don't want to get into the definition of Pan-Africanism yet, but it's an expression of that. And then the fact that we could hire Dr. Obenga here for example, or Kwame Nkrumah could come to the United States and go to university here in the United States, a Black college, you know, and then interchange with Africans in the United States. Again, it's a part of this Pan-African legacy that stands on a particular foundation. And for those that didn't know it, the interview with Dr. Theophile Obenga was broadcast from Congo, Brazzaville. The reason we couldn't have it the week before is he was in Congo, Kinshasa, which is the big Congo, neighboring to Congo, Brazzaville, and they had spillover from the conference, so they couldn't do the workshop. So that was coming directly from Africa. For those of you that didn't know, because I told somebody, I thought they knew this. Yeah, it was from Africa. And so it was important that Dr. Obenga acknowledged that at least his mind was fertilized by the thought of the African University, which I know he had probably already had through these discussions, and especially of all of them, Dr. Jacob Carruthers, because that was a passion of his. He wanted to see the establishment of an African university. So this is an example of the kind of dialogue that we need to have. Now, I'm a Pan-Africanist, and I have contacts all over the world. And in fact, as a Pan-Africanist, and we have a good listening audience from the United Kingdom, I've been working in the United Kingdom now since 1974, and working with the Pan-African Congress movement, working with African people in the UK, in the beginning, coming out of the Sixth Pan-African Congress, where they sent a delegation, and I chaired the political committee to the Sixth Pan-African Congress for North America, the most important committee at the Sixth Pan-African Congress. And they had a brother named Ron Phillips, who was a spokesperson for their delegation. He was an engineer from Guyana and gave the best speech delivered by an African in the diaspora that is outside of Africa. And so I've had this collaboration going on with a Pan-African collaboration around work. We did work around African Liberation Day, and we've done work on other things. People from the UK would come to the US and they would support our African Liberation Days. We had the largest in the US, 25 to 30,000 every year for about 8 years, under the leadership of the Pan-African Secretariat and the Pan-African People's Organization that I'm proud to still be a part of, founded and chair it. It's a successor to the Congress of Racial Equality. And a lot of Garvey's ideas influenced that, especially economic self-reliance. Our money comes from our people. So Pan-Africanism is at my root. So when I'm talking about this isn't just an intellectual discussion. My wife is from Barbados. I'm in a Pan-African marriage. I met my wife while I was in the United Kingdom speaking on behalf of the anniversary, the 60th anniversary of the 5th Pan-African Congress. And I spoke in Manchester, where the 5th Pan-African Congress was held. The last house I stayed in was my wife's house. That's the benefits of Pan-Africanism, by the way. So love. In fact, I'm dedicating this show today to Norma Lynch, my wife, Pamela Hurley, Tashaka's mother, who passed away a few days ago, a lady from Barbados, beautiful lady, retired nurse, a mother of 3 children, actually 4, 1, 2, 3, well, 3 children, a great woman. So Pan-Africanism is in my blood. And then, as we're going to see, Garvey was a central force in the Pan-African movement. What you see here is a book, Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, or Africa for the Africans. This is one of the original 300 books published by the Universal Negro Improvement Association while Garvey was in prison, framed by the FBI. And I purchased this and the second volume from Louis Michaud's bookstore, which was the University of the Community of Harlem and the university in which Malcolm studied. He would fall asleep in the stacks of books there. And as a chair of the Congress of Racial Equality, I'd go to New York and stay usually at the Harlem YMCA and see James Brown perform after Central Committee meetings. And I would always go by Michaud's bookstore because I had undergone an awakening in '63 and Garvey became my first master. And so I'd ask Michaud if he had any copies of Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. He finally found 2 volumes, $100. Now that was around 1964, and $100 was like 800 now. And I managed to scrape it together. And this book sits on a guarded shelf in my library. Nobody's allowed to touch it. It's like almost a Bible for me. So Garveyism. Garvey's my first master. He was one of the most advanced Pan Africanists, though he didn't use the term. So Pan Africanism is in my blood, it's in my heart, it's in my soul. As you may gather, I love Black folks, African people, wherever they are, and I love Africa. I love Africa. As I've told you before, I spent time in the villages in Africa, meeting with African leaders, doing organizing, intellectual exchanges, political, whatever. So this discussion also springs from experience, and it's part of Pan-Africanism, the thought that has helped to shape my own consciousness. In the discussion with Dr. Leonard Jeffries, he talked about Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop's prophecy. And the prophecy was that the African wind would blow from the West to Africa. And by this, he was prophesizing the Afrocentric cultural wind that began blowing in the 80s and in the 90s, which he would be the titular inspiration of. But he was also drawing from another wind that had been blowing a lot earlier that came out of the United States and particularly the Caribbean. And that was the wind of Ethiopianism. And that's what I'm going to spend more time on in this discussion this morning than anything else. The Ethiopia and Ethiopianism is really the womb out of which Pan-Africanism spread. And we often now ignore it because it has largely spent its course now. It is not the force that it was at the time of enslavement, at the time of colonialism, because it was a force both in Africa and in the Caribbean and United States. But it was